For much of Iceland's history, there was basically nothing there. Until really very recently, much of the island was barren and infertile. Iceland is highly volcanic. It's experienced eruptions that threw ash clouds into the air that could darken the sky for days or even weeks. Historically, these eruptions have been calamitous for the people of Iceland, killing their livestock and the little crops they had. Waves of disease have swept across Iceland, from the Black Death to smallpox, ravaging the small communities that had been able to eke out an existence on the barren land. And outside powers have dominated and controlled the island's economy and trade, working to exploit it for their own gain. That Iceland developed into a nation-state at all is incredible. That the island was able to become one of the richest countries in the world is almost a miracle. Iceland was first settled by Swedish Vikings in the year 870. Before this, Norsemen had migrated to the island seasonally, traversing the waves in the summer months when the weather was good and the seas calmer, then hunting and fishing in the winter months to survive, before migrating back to mainland Scandinavia. Following the establishment of permanent settlements, Iceland acted as a de facto independent state until 1262, when it formed a union with Norway. What followed was 800 years of foreign domination of Iceland. First, Norway took control. Then, following the merging of the Norwegian and Danish crowns, and then the breakup of this union following the Napoleonic Wars, Iceland then came under Danish rule. If you were an Icelandic fisherman in the 1700s, you admittedly lived on a barren and mostly infertile island. But you lived on the shores of some of the greatest fishing waters in the world. You should be prosperous, selling your fish to the growing markets of Great Britain, Portugal and Germany. But you're miserably poor, even by the standards of the 18th century. Your fish sell for next to nothing, and only to one market, Denmark's. Denmark imposed a monopoly on Icelandic trade from 602 until 1786. This meant all Icelandic products could only be sold in Denmark. Iceland by this time had been able to use advancements in agricultural technology to develop a moderate, if limited, farming industry. Although fishing was still the most important economic sector, followed by trade in wools and metals. However, Icelanders were forced to sell their goods at below market rates to the Danes. This trapped the island in poverty, as it prevented Icelanders from gaining higher prices selling their goods on the global market. On the 10th of May 1940, Britain invaded Iceland. They didn't stay long though. The Americans arrived only 14 months later. In fact, Iceland actually invited the United States to occupy them. They were allowing British troops to be withdrawn so they could be deployed to other theatres of World War II. America at the time was neutral. Iceland saw that aligning itself with Western allies in the war would reap massive economic gains once it had ended. The world had woken up to Iceland's strategic location, perfectly situated between Europe and North America, along vital shipping routes and ideal for aircraft refueling. Iceland's position made it critical to the Allied war effort. Iceland's economy boomed during the war years. The island's reserves of timber, wool and metals, which previously had only seen limited exploitation, received an influx of British and American funding. But Iceland also benefited long-term, finally being able to industrialise key economic sectors. The massive influx of servicemen and women also provided new ways for Icelanders to earn an income, planting the seeds of a service-based economy. But the British and later American occupations of Iceland were not the only ways that the Second World War entirely changed the country's economic fortunes. Denmark had been invaded by Nazi Germany in April 1940. Iceland used this as a pretense to hold a referendum on independence. With a majority of Icelanders voting in favour, the island became an independent nation on the 17th of June 1944.
To save Europe from this disaster, General George C. Marshall, the United States Secretary of State, in 1947 made a dramatic appeal to the people of Europe. If they would work together, the United States would supply the money for food and raw materials essential to recovery.
The Marshall Plan was essentially America's effort to bribe Western Europe to stay away from communism. With the Soviets controlling everything east of the Elbe River, America feared the destruction and poverty resulting from the war would make communism more appealing to the people of Western Europe. But out of all the countries to receive Marshall Plan aid, the nation that received the most per capita hadn't even fought in the war. The Second World War had alerted America and Europe to Iceland's strategic importance. Now, as the Cold War became entrenched, denying Iceland to the Soviets became a vital part of US foreign policy. Iceland was still poor, but the decades after World War II saw Iceland use American funds to further build its manufacturing base. Public services, including education and healthcare, also improved. However, it wasn't just American money that was transforming Iceland, but also American ideas, especially the ideals of free market, low tax and low regulation economics. Iceland embarked on these policies aggressively from the 1970s onwards. For 3 decades they worked, and then suddenly they didn't. On the 20th of January 2009, thousands of people protested in front of Iceland's parliament. Within weeks, the government had collapsed. 4 months earlier, all 3 of Iceland's banks had been renationalised. They then collapsed entirely. The value of Iceland's currency was cut in half. House prices and individual net worths fell by 1/3 overnight. And almost every business in Iceland was either technically or actually insolvent by the end of 2009. Iceland's economy was almost entirely destroyed. Iceland had privatised its banking sector in the 1990s. At first, free market reforms adopted in the 70s and 80s were barred from reaching the financial service industry. But by the 1990s, with Iceland's economy booming, the government took the now controversial decision to denationalise the country's banks. Iceland's financial sector took off as a result. The problem though is Iceland is a small country. There is only so much bankers can invest in. So Icelandic banks began looking overseas. The global economy was riding high and foreign markets proved lucrative. Soon, Iceland's economy had been transformed by the banking bonanza, meaning that investment banks and financial services began making up a huge proportion of Iceland's economy. But the country's overexposure to foreign markets proved disastrous. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, investors pulled their funds. Iceland's central bank, dependent entirely on tax income from the nation's citizenry, lacked the funds to prop up the banks. The banks failed, and so followed one of the worst national economic collapses in history. Iceland today is known for its tourism. The country welcomes 1.7 million visitors a year. Stunning landscapes, unique vistas, thermal springs, whale watch, northern lights, nightlife, food and culture. Iceland seems to be the top of everyone's travel bucket list. Iceland's modern rise to wealth is directly coupled with its ascendancy as a tourism hotspot. But this was never inevitable. In fact, the country's economic crisis is one of the biggest reasons why its tourism industry boomed. Iceland had begun developing a tourist industry from the 1980s onwards. As flight prices came down and air travel became more affordable, Iceland began to position itself as a vacation destination. However, after the country's 2009 financial crisis, Iceland's government needed a way to revitalise the economy and diversify it away from its over-reliance on financial services. What they soon realised was that the economic downturn they were experiencing could provide a direct route out of their problems. The Icelandic krona had lost around half of its value. This made Iceland a highly affordable and competitive tourist destination. Visitors flocked to the country, taking advantage of a favourable exchange rate. The tourism industry exploded, and Iceland rose to become one of the most visited countries in the world. As Iceland's economy began to recover from a financial crash, and with tourism dollars flowing in, the 2010s saw the country's government starting to look at ways to secure the nation's economic future. The country had been scarred by the banking crisis, and there was political consensus that a more sustainable economic model was needed. Iceland's government directed tax revenue raised through tourism towards diversifying the economy. Investment was poured back into fishing, agriculture and the industrial sectors. This model proved highly successful. Today, Iceland can boast a highly diversified and competitive economy. The island's people have a high standard of living, with Iceland being ranked the 8th richest country in the world. That Iceland was able to prosper at all is remarkable. But the island has been able to overcome geographical, political, international and economic hurdles that many much larger nations would have succumbed to truly is a miracle.